Hi, I'm Teresa O'Connor, and this is my friend, Olivia Ritalik. And tonight we're going to be talking about one of the 5 seeds of deep peace. And the particular seed that we're going to talk about is known as engaged empathy. I've heard it said that you will never look into the eyes of someone God does not love. And for me, that points us in the direction of what it means to practice engaged empathy. Olivia here has worked at crisis services and with Jewish family services. And I'm going to ask her if she could share a little bit about her work with us.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Teresa. I'm excited to talk about this and definitely coming at it from a couple different lenses of which we sort of overlap. My background with crisis services, I've worked at 2 different crisis centers over the last 15 years. And I've served on the suicide prevention hotline. I've provided emergency crisis response care, mental health care in our emergency rooms in our communities, and then took over taking a seat more as like a community educator and looking at things from like the macro lens of mental health and how to help our communities respond as like lay people in that way. And then with Jewish Family Services, I am our grant manager, helping us to move forward in how to support our refugees, our immigrants that we serve, and survivors of Holocaust, and a mental health clinic as well. So a kind of a broad spectrum of individuals that my work has, touched.
So I think you're a really good person to talk to about what it means to practice engaged empathy. Like I said at the beginning, one way to think about engaged empathy is to think of it as encountering how we encounter people in our everyday lives and how those encounters can lead to a greater sense of peace, not only for the 2 people involved in the encounter, but for all of us, that it has this ripple effect. That the more peacefully we can behave together, the more we can impact each other to build trust, even with people perhaps that we find challenging, people whose behaviors may be difficult to understand or difficult to manage. But we have to remember that each of us is a beloved child of God. And we need to take that in our approach, I think, in our daily lives, in our work, and in our hope to build a more peaceful, gentler, kinder world. So in your experience, in, say, the mental health field, for example, do you find yourself using engaged empathy as a tool? Or would you describe it more of as a way of being, a way of encountering people?
Sure. Yeah, it was interesting when we first started talking about this. I really had to go in and kind of understand how the words engaged empathy are being defined and how that is something that, how is that different from other schools of thought or training that I've gone through? And as in my experience with mental health response, you certainly would hear about empathy and practicing with empathy, right? So how does that differentiate between empathy and engaged empathy? So what did that really mean? And in really coming to understand the idea of engaged empathy as a practice, and then hearing that sort of statement that you said, that imagine that every person we look at is somebody that God is loving, right? That there's not a single person that we would look at and God doesn't care for. And I think retrospectively, I've always carried that as a practice in the mental health field without the language to it. That when I come into the field, I can look at almost every behavior, every experience in a way that is very non-judgmental. Not that I don't have my own reactions to it, but that is a symptom of an illness. It's a symptom of a disease. And so maybe by carrying this, it helps me to not have such intense reactions or responses when those behaviors can be hard to watch or hard to experience. And sometimes because of the symptom, it's being directed at us as the worker.
Right.
So I would say, sure, like I definitely would say that I carry that with me, and that it mirrors a lot of the education and training that we've gone through from a clinical standpoint.
Okay. And that's an interesting point, because I think it's easy to understand empathy. So many of us can see someone going through a hard time. We can see a sad story on the news. We can watch a news broadcast about an earthquake or a tornado and the devastation that it brings. And we can feel that sense of empathy, of sadness or concern for those people involved. But what does it mean to act on that empathy or to engage that empathy a little bit more deeply, such that we are helping to create trust between people that may have a hard time building trust, may perhaps because of a mental illness or some other diagnosis, or even just their own life experiences. Perhaps this is not always easy for some of the people that we encounter. You'll meet people who come at you in a very defensive posture because they're not trusting and because they're expecting something different from you. They're expecting you to not understand, to not see, to not acknowledge them as a human being, first of all. So I think when we talk about engaged empathy, it sounds simple, but it can be really quite challenging in practice.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because when we talk about, there's, I would say, rooms and doors in which as a mental health worker, it's almost easier to walk into because you know that person's hurting and you're there to like provide the respite and the recovery that that individual needs. But then I think about, one component of our crisis center is domestic violence. And sometimes that meant working with the person surviving abuse and then sometimes having to be in rooms with the abuser. And so how do we take, that's a very difficult population when you think about, how to respond and how you come in even in those circumstances with an engaged empathy as your approach.
Right. I know in some of my past experience as well that it can be challenging. I have had family members who struggle with mental illness, and sometimes their symptoms may be to be angry with you for trying to help, or what seems like for trying to help, but it's just an expression of everything that's going on with them. It's not personal. I think maybe one step of engaged empathy is trying to take that step back and think about what might be going on with the other person apart from yourself. And that's one aspect, I think.
Yeah, certainly. And then, but I also think about the parallel with safety, right? So you can come into this and say I'm not going to continue to cause harm in a harmful scenario. And that might be the level of engaged empathy, but I also might not be able to stay in this dynamic. That might be engaged empathy too, is I'm caring for you by not engaging any further.
Right.
If engaged empathy is I will work at all costs to not cause harm.
And that is a really good point. It certainly is not a feature of engaged empathy to put yourself in danger, or even emotionally harmful situations. I think if we take this and we try to build on it outside of particular work experiences, I know a lot of people who work with the public, you often have to use these sort of, you might have heard them called de-escalation skills, right? Where you're trying to engage with a person who is angry or upset without elevating the hostility or elevating the anger, but trying to make that person feel seen, make that person feel understood. Again, it's recognizing the fundamental humanity of each and every person. I think a challenging way that a lot of us can probably relate to engaged empathy is to consider some of the divisiveness that many of us are noticing in our country right now. There's a lot of black and white thinking. There's a lot of pain involved. You may have family members, for example, that are on the other side of a particular social or political divide, and you may find it extremely difficult to talk with them or to even recognize that they are still that person that God loves. So how do we go about practicing engaged empathy, and how do we think that can help make our communities, our society, a more peaceful place?
Yeah, we were talking about this yesterday, right? And, said like when I think as a society, we're coming into almost every experience living like an outward facing social media experience where it's like we come into a room and our first thought is more like, what should I be putting out on the table? All my thoughts, all my feelings, instead of like the idea around engaged empathy is maybe we're coming in and we're saying, okay, this is a practice of mine. How can we come in and set the tone differently instead of automatically jumping into everything about my thoughts, my feelings, my reactions, that I'm seeing this person who may be very different than myself, and I'm going to consciously say like they are a beloved child of God as well. And or if you're at work, right, they're a human, they're a person that also matters and somebody who deserves to have respect even if we're on different sides of things.
Right. It's like trying to remember that you can disagree with someone. You may not even particularly enjoy spending time with that person, and certainly it's not required that you would. What is required, however, is the sense of not wishing them ill, perhaps, or wishing them harm. And again, it is challenging when someone is angry or when someone just holds viewpoints that perhaps are just unacceptable to you. But what's important about this is not just our own interpersonal reactions, our own individual relationships with our friends, our coworkers, our family members. But this attitude or this practice of engaged empathy helps to build trust in a community, because perhaps you have a disagreement with someone and you can remain in disagreement about whatever the issue may be. However, if we can see that each person deserves respect, deserves recognition of their humanity, then we can build trust. Like, I may disagree with you, let's say. Maybe I think that apple pie is much better than pumpkin pie. It's probably a silly example, but we can still be friends. That's again, a silly example, but we can agree to be in different places, again, without wishing each other harm. And that is the beginning of planting a deep seed of peace, because we start to see people who are different from us, people who perhaps have a different gender identity, perhaps people from another country, from people from another political party. We start to see them as people who we disagree with, but who we know, because we have practiced our engaged empathy, and hopefully they have practiced it with us, that they aren't going to cause us harm outside of disagreeing with us. And what this does is it allows us to foster a culture of respect and a culture of trust. And there is good biblical precedence for this, of course. We all know that Jesus asked us to love our enemies. And we also know that when Jesus said, love your enemies, he didn't mean that we had to become best friends with them. But what he meant was for us to try and find a way to live together so that we can begin to create a soil, if you will, where peace can take root, where peace in our world can take root, where peace in our families can take root, where peace in our communities can take root. Because once we fundamentally realize that we can't get through this apart from each other, that we are all in this world together, for better, for worse, our hope is to want to make it better. When you practice engaged empathy, how do you find that it changes the way people respond to you, or does it change the way people respond to you?
Yeah, I think that, I was saying that it can be hard to think of engaged empathy separate from other training like trauma-informed care, person-centered, response, even from a biblical standpoint of like unconditional love. Like, I think those are identities in which we carry ourselves. I am a Lutheran who is also a mental health worker. And so I carry those like foundational pieces with me. But I think that the more we can practice that empathy, that the engaged empathy approach of coming in, it definitely, when a person feels seen and heard, even in a deep crisis, they feel valued, and they can also look back at that experience and see how they were cared for and treated. So from my lens in that space, I do think that it brings about the sense that somebody matters, their voice is valuable, and no matter where we sit at the table of different perspectives. And in my experience, sure, like you can build trust with one another, even being in different places and different spaces. In my professional space, I've seen that.
And it's interesting, I don't know if we talked about this specifically yet, but to think about how that experience of feeling recognized, of feeling acknowledged, and developing a certain level of trust with each other, like how does that expand upward to create a more peaceful, just society? The sort of physical violence that represents sort of the very top of a violence iceberg, the physical violence that we see in the world, and the stuff that frankly frightens most of us, right? How often those violent responses are the result of fear and distrust and defensiveness.
Yeah.
So this, like I said, I want to make clear that this isn't just an interpersonal exercise, that this is key for all of us. And when we talk about interdependence, that we talk about that all people on this planet, with all the animals and all the birds and trees and everything, this whole entire system of a world that we live in depends on us not destroying it, not destroying each other. And while policy solutions can seem very far removed from most of our lives, most of us aren't going to go to Congress, we aren't going to propose legislation. Some of us might, and that is fantastic, but most of us aren't. So what can we do to begin the work of cultivating the soil, of planting that seed of deep peace?
Yeah, I'm thinking about if you accidentally, like, if you're saying I'm going to embody the idea of engaged empathy, it's almost a resistance to not engage if you come across someone who's not willing to engage. It's like it's creating like a whole different like community around us, because if I walk into a room, someone might feel they almost want to engage outside of that.
Right.
And especially we've seen that in our communities in the last month or two, where it's just like, no me, no me, no me. But if I walk into a room and I say, no, like I'm here and I'm engaging at large and engaged empathy, then does that potentially diffuse because I'm not willing to step into that space? Like I'm making a conscious choice to not step into anything other than what's going to not cause harm.
Right. And I think that's an excellent point of that. Sometimes engaged empathy can almost look like resistance because you're refusing to join someone in that space of anger and distrust and hostility and violence. So it's not just simply a, hey, let's be nice to each other. Again, it sounds simple, but it's a little more difficult to practice.
It's active.
It is very active.
Yeah.
It is very active. I would agree with that. And I really like the point that you made that sometimes it can look like resistance. Sometimes it can, refusing to engage an angry person sometimes is the most respectful, kind thing that you can do for them, to engage in their anger. Well, let's see. As we wrap up here, I guess I'd just like to sort of reiterate this idea of using engaged empathy as a practice in your own life, to begin to start planting these seeds of peace everywhere that we can. It's not always going to be easy. You won't always be successful. But I think the more seeds that we can plant, the greater the reward will be, the greater the harvest will reap, if you will, since we're using the seed metaphor. The greater amount of peace we'll feel in our own communities, particularly as we go forward in an extremely divided time. I think not only in our own country's history, but it seems to be there's a lot of division and strife worldwide. So I think it's part of our call as Christians to begin planting those seeds, to learn how to create a trust amongst ourselves, amongst people that perhaps we have a hard time understanding, or people we just don't agree with, or people we just don't like even. It's important that we are called to love our enemies, and that's a very action-oriented word as well. Love, when we talk about it in this sense that Jesus talked about it, isn't that warm, happy feeling that we get necessarily, but it's the actions we choose. And the actions we choose by remembering that we will never look into the eyes of someone God does not love. Amen.
Amen.